is a strong anti-intellectual movement, anti-God movement, anti-reason movement in the West. I'd say it's global. You know, it's to the point now where the average person, and we're just being honest here, the average person doesn't read. The average person today would hear someone with a slightly above average vocabulary and they would probably want to insult the person for being able to speak in a way that they're not familiar with. It's pathetic, actually, and it's sad. Because there was a time where a great majority of people were well-read. A great majority of people took some type of pride in understanding the world around them, knowing the classics, knowing scripture, also knowing who they are in relation to others and in relation to God, because that's what the self is, the understanding of your relation to others and your relation to God, and your identity comes from Jesus Christ. And your idiosyncrasies, your specialties, and your unique nature, that becomes the odds and ends that set you apart, that creates you as a self, as an identity. But it seems to me what we focus on now are those in-betweens and those unique idiosyncrasies. We focus on more egoistic aspects of ourselves instead of those parts of us that really matter the most, that give us our foundation, that enable us to even understand those unique things about ourselves, you know, that connection to God. And once you understand who you are in relation to the Most High, once you understand who Christ is and what Christ did for you, you can move forward in life from that point forward, understanding why you're here and who you are, what you mean to the world, what you have to offer, and what others mean to you. Now, this is difficult when you live in a world where you're a minority in that regard, right? Where the most people around you aren't on that level. And I'm not saying it's a level like it's a level above. I feel like without any real grasp on these types of classic ideals, we will just continue to go downhill culturally. And we will continue to see the youth fall away because they have no guidance. You know, this is never gonna end. Suicide will become a normal thing. And just this whole idea of pushing sexuality early. Getting back to this idea of the dumbing down of the younger generations and just society in general. It's an educational dumbing down, a spiritual dumbing down, but then this hypersexual thing. I want to talk a little bit about sex education, a little bit about Planned Parenthood. So I want to talk a little bit about your sexuality is yourself as the total person you are. And we've talked about her before. Mary Calderon, yes, she is the mother of sexual education. First, I want to go into the history of sex education via Planned Parenthood. And I just want to read some of this to you to give you an idea of how this crap is sold. This is how it's sold to the masses. This is how it's indoctrinated society. What we'll find here is these perspectives are put directly into the media, into the movies, the Netflix series regarding sex, right? As well into the children education. So check this out. Sexual health is the integration of the somatic, emotional, intellectual, and social aspects of sexual being in ways that are positively enriching and that enhance personality, communication, and love. Fundamental to this concept are the right to sexual information and the right to pleasure. I mean, just the wording here, it's so Wilhelm Reich. It's just so obsessed with sex as a form of self-gratification. Of course, there's a pleasure component to sex. I understand this, but when it comes to education, you start to kind of get away from the importance of what education is when you start to include pleasurable aspects of it. And I say that to say the purpose of education is to get people to understand the meaning, its depth. The pleasurable aspects of sexuality, those are the surface level, flesh level. What are the deep meanings and purposes of it, right? So here it seems enhanced personality. I don't know about that. I don't know if that's necessarily true. That really comes from this Wilhelm Reich, this neoliberal psychological perspective. Communication and love. But yes, I agree with that. And marriage, yes, absolutely. I think in marriage it is part of communication and love. There's positive things there for sure. And then it starts to get a little weird. Freedom from fear, shame, guilt, false beliefs. Do you see how an ideology or worldview is literally baked into this? It's in no way is this objective. It tries to come off as some type of arbiter of sexuality. What we see here is, I would say, bias, false beliefs. What do you think those false beliefs are that they're referring to? Thus, the notion of sexual health implies a positive approach to human sexuality. See this sex positivity, right? Sex positive. Isn't that the new thing now? Sex positivity? Meaning all things sexual must be perceived as positive by all people, forcing a type of ideology on all people, even if it is completely contradictory to their beliefs, imposing one's belief system on another. And the purpose of sexual health care should be the enhancement of life and personal relationships, and not merely counseling and care related to procreation or sexually transmitted diseases. So now they're sexual therapists, basically. Because as far as I knew, I always thought, this sex education usually has to do with how sex relates to procreation and sexually transmitted diseases, how sex can harm you. Never was it really about how it can improve your life or your personal relationships or your personality. Let's see, whose early definition is at the core of our understanding of sexual today and is a departure from prevailing notions about sexual health and sex education that predominated in the 19th and 20th century. Until the 1960s and 1970s, the goals of social hygiene and moral purity activists eclipsed broader sexual health concerns in the public health arena. Their narrow goals were to prevent sexually transmitted infections, stamp out masturbation and prostitution, and limit sexual expression to marriage. So you see here how they're equating moral values with some type of authoritarianism. They're trying to say, look at how all of these rules withheld us from learning what sex is really about. Now, the reason we're discussing this is not because I need to explain to you guys anything about sex. That's not at all. This is regarding what is being taught to children about sex. Now, if these things were being, directed towards adults, it would be a little more understandable. Not to say I'd agree with it, but I could, because these are mature concepts here. These are mature things they're talking about here. But this is for children, which is frightening. From the 1960s on, support for sex education in schools began to gain widespread support. However, beginning in the 1980s, a debate began in the United States between a more comprehensive approach to sex education, which provided information about sexual health, including information about contraception, and abstinence-only programs. Education about sex and sexuality in U.S. schools progressed in these two divergent directions. Former was based on the belief that medically accurate and comprehensive information about sexual health would decrease risk-taking behaviors among young people. The latter was based on the erroneous belief that medically accurate, comprehensive information would increase risk-taking behaviors among young adults or young people. There is now significant evidence that a comprehensive approach to sex education promotes sexual health among young people by reducing sexual risk-taking behavior. The abstinence-only approach has not shown these results, so you can see where they're going with this. If you really want to be honest about these things, of course it's clear we can understand from a faith-based perspective, from the Christian worldview, abstinence is the only way to go, right? We understand that sex is for marriage. There's definitely a spiritual bond, a reproductive foundation there. But also we can look at plenty of secular science that would agree with this, and that's what bothers me so much about some of this stuff. And I understand today and for a long time, science, you can get scientists to take completely opposing positions and come up with tons of evidence for both. It really comes to the point where it's like a zero-sum game almost. That's the bad thing about science. It fluctuates, right? It's constantly changing. But also I'd say a lot of it has to do with funding, promotion, popularity. Whatever's promoted the most, whatever becomes most popular, has the most funding, usually becomes the truth. So what I believe, it's not that their science is correct. Those that come up with this pseudoscience that's claiming an opposing position, that's just clearly not true. It's just they have the backing, they have the support, they have the eyes, they have the ears, they have the attention of the society. Yes, so then we have, here she is, Mary Calderon. She's pretty much the mother of the founder of sexual education. So let's read a little bit about her. The reason I bring this up is because what we're going to find out is this woman's perspective, along with all her supporters and all of the organizations and groups that she worked with, their world worldview, their perspective is what we have inherited. And it's what we see pushed in all of our propaganda media. What Rachel Carson did for the environment and Margaret Sanger did for birth control, Mary Calderon did for sex education, a reporter for People magazine casually observed in 1980. Calderon was a cultural icon in the 1970s and the early 1980s, the first medical director of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America and later co-founder, executive director, and president of the Sex Information and Education Council on the United States. She was profiled in magazines from Family Circle to Playboy. Interesting, isn't it? The woman that is, clearly bringing out sex education for children is also being interviewed by Playboy magazine. It's just so polar. Once in a position, she made it her goal to convince major professional organizations such as the American Public Health Association and the American Medical Association to consider family planning as part of comprehensive health care. Now, if we do just a little bit of studies into sociology, you'll learn very early that family planning was and is a big part of the changing of the guard, or the switching roles of parent and state. So family planning was pretty much a movement where the state began to not only take over the understanding, education, and indoctrination and enculturation of children, but also structuring the family, or at least holding the position that dictates what the proper structure of a family should be. And of course, through this, we got a lot of the Frankfurt School authoritarian personality was a great example of this, that deemed the nuclear family authoritarian and pretty much useless, and all it really does is produce abusive men and damsels in distress. Right? The APHA issued a statement to that effect in 1959, and the AMA followed suit in 1964. Calderon is often credited for the turnaround, though in her lifetime she was quick to draw attention to a dedicated movement behind it. In the 1960s, her interest shifted from family planning to the human relationships which make birth control necessary. So now we're getting into premarital sex. We're getting into this whole push for sexualized youth. Because there was a time where it just wasn't common. There's definitely more of a moral code, right, in society. And this is one of those things that kind of broke that down institutionally. She says, I'm more interested in how people form their sexual attitudes. In 1964, she joined with 4 like-minded colleagues to form the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, known by its acronym SICUS. Its mission was to help remove the shame. This is important here. This is important here. Its mission was to help remove the shame and embarrassment that often accompany discussions of sexual matters, and treat sexuality as fundamental to human experience and human health. In practice, SICUS offered information and resources that parents, schools, and religious and community organizations could use to develop sex education programs to suit their own purposes. I have a really big problem with this. Remove the shame and embarrassment that often accompanied discussions of sexual matters, and treat sexuality as fundamental to human experience and human health. Sexuality, I'd say to a degree, is fundamental to the human experience. It has all to do with our ability to reproduce, and it does to a degree have some level of influence on human health. But this idea of removing shame and embarrassment, I want to speak on that. In my view, and not the abuse of shame. I think shame has a practical purpose in life, and so does embarrassment. Just like pain has a practical purpose and use in life. Pain protects you from things that could hurt you or are hurting you. For instance, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to pull your hand away immediately because you feel that pain. These are what nerves are for. They protect our body. They protect our frames from being harmed. You pull your hand away and you save your hand from being burned further. Yeah, it hurt, but you needed to feel that pain. Otherwise, imagine if you had no pain sensors and you just left your hand on the stove and you leaned on it and you just leaning, and then you look and your hand's severely damaged to the point where you can no longer use it. You'd be pretty upset at that point. Pain it protects you, but it can be abused. It can be used as a weapon. Pain can be inflicted on others, or pain can masochistically be enjoyed. When you assess pain in this way, we understand that this is where they are not practical, or not being used practically, or it is not being used practically in these situations. But there's a practical use for pain, or purpose for pain. Same for shame, same for embarrassment. Sometimes you should be embarrassed. Sometimes you should feel shame when you do things that are wrong, when you do things that are counterproductive to your needs, to your true needs, not your desires, to your true needs. What's good for you, what's meant for you, what's best for you, right? And then embarrassment is it keeps people from doing foolish things that they should not. And of course, shame and embarrassment can be abused, just like the pain example. People could purposely embarrass you to cause harm. They can use embarrassment as a weapon against you, or they can use shame as a weapon against you, a form of manipulation, gaslighting, this idea of making you feel as if you did something that you should be ashamed of when you didn't, or causing a situation that they know will embarrass you. Those are examples of shame and abuse, or shame and embarrassment being used in an abusive manner. But there is a practical and purposeful component when we're looking at shame and embarrassment. In many cases, where they lie, they are meant to, and especially when it comes to things that can harm you, or that are not fit for you, that are not meant for you in the stage that you are in. And it is my contention that children are in no developmental, spiritual, or psychological stage to properly understand the depths, I would even say complex and convoluted aspects of sex. There is a purpose for shame and embarrassment when it comes to that, because it keeps people humble. It keeps people modest. When there is a little shame, when there is a little embarrassment, in a practical, healthy, righteous sense. The problem is, we notice they want to remove all of this. They want to remove the shame and embarrassment. They want to make it free and liberated for everyone. No holds barred, limitless. This is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disorder. It's a recipe for possession. And this is kind of where it started. It seems like everything came after the 60s. I always find us going right back to the 60s, because so much happened in this short little time. Help remove the shame and embarrassment. Calderon oversaw Psychus at a time of resurgent activism among evangelical Christians who opposed the organization's philosophy and goals. Well, of course. She became a cultural lightning rod among some activist groups as debates over sexuality and feminism intensified in the late 1960s and 1970s. So here we go, guys. It's not about the children. It's not about sexuality. It's about an ideology that it's an amalgamation of all of these different movements, from sexual revolution to feminism and into homosexual movement, the gay movement that started in 1969 with the Stonewall riots and got its heyday by 1970, were rolled out together. And that's why we see them rearing their ugly heads concurrently, all around the same time, because it's all one movement. And it's not even about the individuals used in the movement. For instance, feminism wasn't, well, I think the first wave of feminism, I could definitely see the importance there. Second wave, it started to get a little sidetracked. It started to become more of a political ideology opposed to a fight, a risk taken by women to acquire new experiences and achieve new goals. I think it had more to do with economic and political things. It was controlled at a higher level, very much so out of the hands of the women that were involved, especially those that were in the streets fighting. And the same can be said about all of these movements over time, especially to this day. It's all a bunch of madness at this point. And no one even knows the purpose anymore, because there really was no purpose outside of control, completely shifting the cultural norms, shifting the ideology, the consensus, creating a new liberated, postmodern, new world. A new age, the age of Aquarius, curious and conquering child of Crowley. It's amazing how we can read all of these things right into it, because they all align, they all stand upon the same foundation.